Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something. There are moments in life that look insignificant on the surface. A phone call at the wrong hour, a favor asked too casually, a door opened out of politeness. And then, that moment rewrites everything. This is a story about a man named Dalton Price, a 38-year-old single father who worked as a night maintenance supervisor at one of the most powerful tech companies in the entire state of Virginia. He wasn't rich. He wasn't connected. He didn't have a degree hanging on a wall or a last name that opened doors. What he had was a 7-year-old daughter named Rosie, a lunch pail, a work ethic so deep it went bone level, and a quiet kind of dignity that most people in that building never even noticed, until the night the CEO called him personally and asked him to stay. And what happened after that one night changed both their lives in ways that neither of them could have ever predicted. Stay with me. Because this one is going to hit you. Let's go back to the beginning. Dalton Price grew up in a small town called Harpwell, just outside of Richmond, Virginia. The kind of town where everyone waves from their porch and half the main street is vacant by dinner time. His father worked at a lumber yard. His mother cleaned office buildings downtown. They weren't wealthy, but they were honest, and they gave Dalton something money can't manufacture: a work ethic that didn't know the word quit. Dalton was the first in his family to graduate high school with honors. He had dreams of going to college for engineering. He'd filled out 3 applications, but he had a partial scholarship lined up at a state school in Charlottesville. And then, life happened. His mother had a stroke the summer before he was supposed to leave. His father, already struggling with his knees, couldn't manage alone. Dalton quietly folded those acceptance letters, put them in a drawer, and never talked about it again. He stayed. He worked. He took a job at a plumbing supply company, then a warehouse, then a facilities management company that contracted maintenance services to corporate offices. By the time he was 30, he was a team lead. By 32, he was a night supervisor. He wasn't bitter about the life he was living. He genuinely wasn't. But there were nights, long, quiet nights, when he'd walk through the gleaming lobbies of glass towers, see the names of executives on frosted office doors, or watch the cleaning lights flicker to life over mahogany desks stacked with reports and projections, and he'd think, just for a second, I could have been on that side of the glass. He never said it out loud. He'd just pick up his equipment and keep moving. Then came Rosie. Rosie's mother, a woman named Petra, and Dalton had met at a local community event when they were both 29. She was funny and warm, and had a laugh that filled whatever room she was in. They dated for a year, got engaged, had Rosie, and then when Rosie was barely 14 months old, Petra was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. She fought hard. Lord, she fought. Dalton worked double shifts to cover the medical bills and still made it home in time to read Rosie her bedtime stories every single night. Not once did he miss a bedtime story. Not once. Petra passed just after Rosie turned 2. She never got to hear Rosie say a full sentence, never got to see her walk confidently, never got to know the little girl who would grow up with her mother's laugh and her father's determination. Dalton buried his grief in routine, in purpose, in Rosie. He arranged his work schedule around school drop-offs. He negotiated with his supervisor to always work night shifts, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., so he could be home when Rosie woke up and walk her to school himself. His neighbor, an elderly woman named Greta Solis, would come over at 9:30 p.m. and sit with Rosie until she fell asleep, then stay in the guest room until Dalton came home at dawn. That was the arrangement, that was the system, and it worked. Until the night it almost didn't. Dalton's current assignment was at the headquarters of Viridian Technologies, a $4.2 billion enterprise software company based in downtown Arlington, Virginia. 42 floors, nearly 2,000 employees, sleek, aggressive, relentless. The kind of company where people used phrases like synergize the deliverables, unironically, and booked 7 a.m. meetings as a power move. Dalton supervised a crew of 8 people who serviced floors 28 through 42, the executive floors, conference rooms with million-dollar views, server rooms humming with data worth more than most people's entire zip codes, and the corner office on the 42nd floor, the one with the city lights laid out like a circuit board below it, belonging to Conrad Hale. The CEO, Conrad Hale, 51, self-made. Brilliant. Undemanding in a way that made people around him feel like they were always one step behind. He'd built Viridian from a startup in his garage in 2003 to a publicly traded giant by 2019. He worked late. Every night. His assistant had once told someone that Conrad's lights were always on last and always on first. The man practically lived in that building. His personal life, from what the staff could gather, was complicated. He'd been married once, briefly, in his late 30s. His ex-wife, Sylvie, had moved to Portland with their teenage son, Fletcher, and from what people whispered, Conrad had missed so many school events and family milestones that Fletcher barely returned his calls anymore. Conrad wasn't cruel, he wasn't evil, he was just consumed. The company was his identity. The company was his child. Taken the way he understood children, as something to build, to optimize, to push harder. He was not the kind of man who noticed maintenance staff. But that was about to change. It was a Wednesday in November. Dalton and his crew had finished the main corridors and split off to handle their individual zones. Dalton always saved the 42nd floor for last, partly because it required a specific access clearance, and partly because Conrad was usually still there. He respected the man's work ethic, even if he knew nothing else about him. That night, Dalton came off the elevator at 1:47 a.m. and found something unusual. Conrad's office light was on. That was normal. But the hallway light near the executive bathroom was flickering badly, and there was a smell in the air. Sharp. Electrical. Dalton set his cart down and followed his nose. But he found the source, a panel in the ceiling of the server antechamber just outside the main server room. A wiring connection had loosened and was arcing against its housing. Small sparks, barely visible, but in a room full of servers and proprietary data worth hundreds of millions of dollars, it was a time bomb. Without hesitating, Dalton radioed his crew to bring his tool bag from the cart. He also called the emergency facilities line to get the on-call electrician notified. Then, because he understood enough about electrical systems from years of work and from a general studies electrician's course he'd taken online 3 years ago, he carefully isolated the breaker panel for that corridor section. He didn't touch the arc. He contained it. He cleared the area. He documented everything with his phone camera. And then he heard a voice behind him. "What's happening?" Conrad Hale, in his shirt sleeves, reading glasses still on, coffee in hand, staring at Dalton like he'd materialized from nowhere. Dalton explained, calmly and clearly, exactly what he'd found. what he'd done, and what the electrician would need to address when they arrived. He used technical language without being condescending, and he was direct. Conrad studied him for a moment. "You probably just saved $12 million worth of data." Dalton shrugged. "Just doing my job, sir." Conrad looked at the isolated panel, then back at Dalton. "What's your name?" "Dalton. Dalton Price. Night supervisor, floors 28 through 42. Conrad nodded slowly. "Thank you, Dalton." That was it. Conrad went back to his office. Dalton waited for the electrician, oversaw the repair documentation, and clocked out at 6:14 a.m. He thought nothing more of it, but Conrad Hale thought about it for the rest of that week. 3 weeks later, Dalton got a call he wasn't expecting. Not on his work radio, not through his supervisor, on his personal cell phone. He was on his break, eating a ham sandwich and reading a library book about aerospace engineering, an old habit, reading things he loved but never got to professionally study, when his phone buzzed with an unknown local number. "Hello? Is this Dalton Price?" The voice was direct, controlled, familiar in a way Dalton couldn't immediately place. "Yes, who is this?" "Conrad Hale, Viridian Technologies. I hope this isn't a bad time." Dalton nearly choked on his sandwich. He set it down carefully. "Mr. Hale." "No, sir, not at all." "I got your number from HR. I hope that's acceptable." It wasn't particularly protocol, Dalton thought, but aloud he said, "Of course." "I have an unusual situation," Conrad said, "and I need someone I can trust. After what I saw a few weeks ago, you came to mind." He explained it like this. His company was in the middle of a critical acquisition deal, a potential merger with a European fintech firm called Aldervest. The negotiations had reached a point where Aldervest's lead partner, a man named Peter van Rooyen, was flying in from Amsterdam for a 2-day in-person session. The meetings were to be held off-site at a private lodge about 2 hours outside Arlington, beginning the next morning. The lodge was a secured facility Viridian used for confidential off-site work. It had been prepared. Everything was set. Except, and here Conrad paused, his head of security operations had just been rushed to the hospital with appendicitis. His backup security liaison was in Seattle handling another issue. And there was a specific protocol requirement for someone to physically be present and on-site at the lodge overnight, to manage access credentials, monitor the exterior perimeter cameras, and handle anything unexpected that arose. It was essentially a glorified overnight caretaker role with security responsibilities. Not dangerous, but requiring someone trustworthy, responsible, and capable of handling the unexpected with calm judgment. "Your facility supervisor tells me you hold a valid security guard license," Conrad said. "I do," Dalton said. Virginia had required it for his supervisor clearance level. I need someone there from tonight through tomorrow evening. The actual meetings will be handled by my executive team. I need someone responsible in the background, quiet, steady, capable." Then Conrad added, "I'd compensate you well, significantly above your normal rate." Dalton was quiet for a moment. One night. Quiet lodge, background role. And then a thought hit him like cold water. Rosie. His mind raced. Tonight was Wednesday. Greta Solis had her church women's meeting on Wednesday nights. She'd mentioned just last week she'd be unavailable Wednesday through Friday because her daughter from Louisville was visiting. He'd arranged for a backup sitter, a college student named Addie who lived in his building. But Addie had texted just that morning saying she had a fever. If he took this job, who would be with Rosie? He said, Honestly, Mr. Hale, I appreciate the offer. Genuinely. But I have a situation at home. I'm a single father. My daughter is 7. My usual sitter arrangements fell through tonight, and I can't just bring her. Dalton blinked. Excuse me? Bring your daughter. The lodge has 6 bedrooms. There are no other guests. The meeting doesn't start until 9 a.m. tomorrow. You'd both be there in the evening. She'd sleep. And by the time things get busy, you could have someone pick her up or keep her in the residential wing away from the meetings. A pause. I'm not in the habit of asking favors, Conrad said, but I find myself needing one. And I'd rather trust someone who I've already seen act with good judgment under pressure than pull in a stranger from an agency at the last minute. Bring her. Dalton looked at his sandwich, at the engineering book on the table, at the wall across from him. He thought about the extra money, which he desperately needed, about Rosie's upcoming school trip that he hadn't been able to fully pay for yet. He said yes. Rosie was thrilled. She packed her small purple backpack with 3 books, her stuffed rabbit named Coop, a box of crayons, and, inexplicably, a single rain boot. Dalton didn't question the rain boot. He'd learned that with Rosie, some things were beyond rational inquiry. They drove out to the lodge under a sky full of stars. Rosie pressed her face against the passenger window and pointed at constellations she'd learned about from a library book. That one's Orion, Dad. He's a hunter. But I don't think he was very good at it because he never catches anything. Dalton laughed, really laughed, for the first time in what felt like weeks. The lodge was stunning. A converted historic stone manor on about 40 acres of private land, surrounded by bare-limbed oak trees and a long gravel driveway lit by ground-level solar lights. The inside was warm. Exposed beam ceilings, a great stone fireplace, leather furniture, and an entire kitchen stocked for the week. It was the most beautiful place Dalton had ever stood inside. Rosie walked in, looked around slowly, and said, "Dad, are we rich now?" Dalton took a deep breath. "No, baby, we're working." She considered this. "Okay, can I still use the fireplace?" A lodge caretaker, a quiet man named Birch who handled the property year-round, showed Dalton the security setup, with 6 perimeter cameras, a digital access log, a radio frequency for the property's private channel, an emergency contact binder, a master key card. It was straightforward. Dalton walked the perimeter twice with Birch, noted everything, and set Rosie up in a bedroom down the hall from his monitoring station. A small room near the main entrance that had a desk, a monitor showing camera feeds, and a direct line to the main lodge phone. He got Rosie into her pajamas, read her a chapter from one of her books, a story about a girl who discovers a hidden garden, and turned her lamp to its lowest setting. "You'll stay close?" she asked. "2 doors down," he said. "I'll check on you every 30 minutes. "Okay," she hugged Coop. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "Is the man who owns this place nice?" Dalton thought about Conrad Hale, the direct voice, and the efficient manner, the unexpected, "bring her." "I think," he said carefully, "he's complicated." Rosie nodded sagely. "Like Mrs. Portman next door." "Exactly like Mrs. Portman next door. Now sleep." The night was quiet, uneventful. Dalton did his rounds, checked the cameras, made himself coffee, read the last 50 pages of his engineering book. At 2 a.m., he heard a car on the gravel driveway. He checked the camera. A black town car. He confirmed it on the access log. Conrad Hale had added himself to the overnight roster. Apparently, he'd decided to come to the lodge early, rather than drive out in the morning. Conrad came in with a briefcase and looked genuinely surprised to see Dalton at the monitoring station rather than someone from his regular security team. "Price," he said. "Good." And that was that. He went to the far end of the lodge, and that was the last Dalton saw of him that night. Until 3:17 a.m. Rosie was having a nightmare. Dalton was down the hall in seconds. She'd had them occasionally since she was 3. He suspected it was some deep, unprocessed grief for a mother she barely remembered, but somehow knew was missing. The nightmares were never specific. Just fear, just the dark. He sat on the edge of her bed, pulled her into his arms, and spoke quietly. "You're safe. I'm here. I've got you. Nothing's going to happen to you tonight. I've got you." He rocked her like she was 2 again, sang the little made-up song Petra used to sing. Just a simple melody, no real words, just soft sounds, until Rosie's body went slack against his chest. He sat there for another 20 minutes, just to be sure. When he finally stepped back into the hallway and turned around, Conrad Hale was standing at the end of the corridor. He hadn't meant to intrude. You could see that clearly on his face. He'd heard the cry, apparently, and come to check. The instinct of any adult in a building with a distressed child. He stood there in the half-dark, and the expression on his face was something Dalton had not expected to see on the face of a billionaire CEO loss. Just raw, quiet loss. Like a man watching something through a window he'd locked himself out of years ago and couldn't find the key to anymore. He said nothing, just looked at Dalton holding his daughter. Then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Carry on, don't mind me," and walked quietly back down the hall. Dalton watched him go, and something shifted in the air between them. Something that had no word for it. Rosie woke up at 6:45 a.m., bright as a new penny, apparently completely unaware of the nightmare. She bounced into the kitchen in her pajamas, found Birch setting out breakfast items, and immediately befriended him by asking if the lodge had any animals. "There's a cat," Birch said, clearly charmed. "Lives in the barn. Goes by the name Sargent." Rosie looked at her father. Her eyes were enormous. "Go ahead," he said. "Stay where I can see the barn from the window." She was gone in 15 seconds, one sock still only halfway on. Dalton poured himself coffee and stood at the kitchen window, watching her run across the frost-covered grass toward the barn, purple backpack bouncing. "She's remarkable." He turned. Conrad was behind him, already dressed, dark trousers, open collar, no tie. He looked like he'd slept maybe 4 hours, but his eyes were sharp. Dalton nodded. "She is." Conrad poured himself coffee and stood next to Dalton at the window. For a moment they just watched Rosie disappear into the barn doorway. "How old?" Conrad asked. 7. Turns 8 in February." Conrad nodded. "Her mother?" "Passed away. She was 2. A pause. Not the awkward kind. The kind where the other person is actually sitting with what you've just said, rather than rushing past it. "I'm sorry," Conrad said. And he meant it. It wasn't a reflex. You could tell the difference when people actually meant it. Dalton said, "Thank you." Another moment passed. Then Conrad said quietly, "My son is 17. Lives in Portland with his mother." He turned his coffee mug slowly in both hands. "I haven't spoken to him in 6 weeks. Not because he's angry, just because I run out of things to say, and I think he got tired of waiting for me to find them." He said it like a man reading a line from a report, factual, assessed. but there was something underneath it that didn't match the tone. Dalton looked at him. How long has that been happening? The silence? 3 years, since he was 14. That's a long time. Yes. Conrad drank his coffee. It is. Rosie appeared in the barn doorway, holding something. Apparently Sargent, a massive gray tabby who looked deeply unimpressed but tolerant. She waved at her father from across the yard. He waved back. She looks just like you, Conrad said. People always say she looks like her mother. Maybe she has both, Conrad said. The good parts of both. Dalton looked at him sideways. Conrad was still watching Rosie. And Dalton thought, who is this man? Not the one on the Forbes profile, or the shareholder letters, or the aggressive acquisition headlines. Who is this man actually? The Aldervest team arrived at 9 sharp. Peter Van Rooyen and his delegation of 4. Conrad's executive team rolled in at 9:15. The lodge transformed from a quiet haven into a contained operational center. Dalton managed access, monitored the perimeter, directed vehicles, handled 2 contractor issues that arose with the catering setup, and kept Rosie occupied in the residential wing. He'd told her the rules. Stay in this half of the lodge. Don't go into the meeting rooms. Don't bother any of the adults in suits. Rosie's version of don't bother any adults in suits apparently meant engage exactly 1 adult in suits in a deeply earnest conversation about frogs. But Dalton found her at approximately 11:15 a.m., sitting across from Peter Van Rooyen, who had apparently slipped out of the conference room for a 5-minute air break, on the sunroom steps, talking with complete confidence about the life cycle of frogs. Peter Van Rooyen, who was 62 years old, Dutch and worth approximately $800 million, was listening with the kind of focused, genuine attention that most adults reserve for important board presentations. Dalton started to intervene. Rosie, she's fine, Peter said, waving a hand. His accent was warm, his manner easy outside of business mode. She is telling me about metamorphosis. It is fascinating. Rosie beamed. Dalton stood there a moment, then, because what else do you do, sat down on the steps himself, just close enough to be present. And somehow, was in the odd detour of a high-stakes corporate negotiation day, the 3 of them sat on sunroom steps in the November air and talked about frogs. For 12 minutes. Then Peter's phone buzzed. He stood, straightened his jacket, and looked at Dalton with an expression that was warm and slightly amused. Your daughter, he said, is the most interesting person I have met on this trip. He shook Rosie's hand formally. She shook it back, completely serious. He went back inside. Dalton looked at Rosie. What? She said. Nothing, he said, absolutely nothing. The Aldervest team left at 6 p.m. But the deal wasn't signed that day. These things rarely were. But Dalton overheard Conrad's VP of strategy say to someone in the hallway that the day had gone remarkably well, and that Van Rooyen had seemed more relaxed and open than in any prior meeting. Dalton suspected frogs had somehow contributed to international business negotiations. He kept that thought to himself. Conrad's team departed in waves. By 7:30, only Conrad and Birch remained, and Dalton, who was doing his final perimeter check and access log documentation before he and Rosie drove home. Rosie had eaten dinner. Birch had made grilled cheese and tomato soup, which he declared the second best dinner after my dad's pasta, and was now at the kitchen table drawing a picture of Sargent the cat with her crayons. Conrad came into the kitchen, loosened collar, carrying a half-finished glass of water. He stopped when he saw Rosie drawing. "What's that?" he asked, looking over her shoulder. "Sergeant," she said, "but I made him bigger because he deserves to be bigger." Conrad studied the drawing, a large, somewhat abstract gray blob with yellow eyes and what appeared to be a crown. "Why does he have a crown?" "Because he's a sergeant," she said, like this was self-evident. "That's a rank. He earned it." Conrad Hale, CEO of a $4.2 billion company, man who had not smiled genuinely in what felt to Dalton like a very long time, smiled. Not the controlled, camera-ready smile Dalton had seen in building photos, a real one. Caught off guard, surprised by a 7-year-old's logic. He looked up at Dalton, and Dalton just shrugged. This is daily life. "Welcome." Conrad sat down at the kitchen table, to not in a corner, not at the head, just sat down like a normal person, and watched Rosie color. "Do you like school?" he asked her. "The learning part, yes. The lunch part is complicated." "Why complicated?" "Because Tyler Meston always puts his tray too close to mine and his food smells like old gym shoes, and I've told him twice that there's a personal space rule and he keeps forgetting." "Have you considered," Conrad said seriously, "putting something on your tray that smells worse?" Rosie stared at him. Then she looked at her father. "I like him," she said. Dalton pressed his lips together to keep from laughing. An hour later, Rosie was asleep on the couch under a blanket, Coop tucked under her arm, and Conrad and Dalton were sitting in 2 armchairs near the fire with coffee. It was the kind of quiet that invites honesty, but Conrad spoke first. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly, not as an employee, just as a man." Dalton looked at him. "All right." "How do you do it?" Conrad asked. He wasn't being rhetorical. His voice was stripped of all its executive authority. This was genuine. "How do you work nights, raise a daughter alone, hold everything together, and still—" He searched for the word. "Still be present? Still be the person she runs to?" Dalton was quiet for a moment. "I don't always get it right," he said. "There are weeks when I'm running on 3 hours sleep and cold coffee, and I snap at her over something stupid like spilled cereal, and then spend the rest of the day feeling like the worst person on earth." He looked at the fire. But I think the secret, if there even is one, is that I stopped waiting until things were perfect to show up. I just show up in the middle of the mess. That's all I know." Conrad looked at the fire, too. "I told myself," he said slowly, "that I was building something for Fletcher. The company, the security, the legacy." A pause. "He told me, the last real conversation we had, that he didn't want a legacy. He wanted a father who showed up to his debate competitions." Conrad's jaw tightened. "I missed 17 of them. I counted afterward." 17, Dalton said. 17. The number sat between them like something solid and heavy. "It's not too late," Dalton said. "I'm not sure he agrees." "He's 17. Teenagers don't agree with anything. That's not the same as it being too late." Dalton glanced at Rosie on the couch. "There's something about being someone's parent. It doesn't expire. The door doesn't permanently lock. You just have to decide to knock on it again, and keep knocking." Conrad looked at him for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. Dalton smiled faintly. "Nobody ever means that as an insult. I don't mean it as one." "I know." Another silence, but this one had something different in it, something warmer. Dalton got Rosie home by 8 Sunday morning. She slept the whole drive, and he carried her up to her bed and tucked her in without waking her. He stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her breathe, and felt, as he always did after nights like this, an exhausted, bottomless gratitude that she was okay, that he was here, that they were still in this together. He went to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the table staring out the window at their small backyard with its one stubborn rose bush that bloomed every summer, no matter how little attention it got. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't have saved yet. It read, "Thank you for last night. Not just the work. See Hale." Dalton stared at it. Then he typed back, "Anytime. Get some sleep." 3 seconds later. Noted. He almost laughed. The next week, Dalton reported for his normal night shift. His supervisor, a man named Russ, flagged him at clock in. "You get a note about a formal commendation from the CEO's office," Russ said, looking mildly baffled. "Something about the electrical situation a few weeks back, and last weekend." "Everything get handled correctly?" Dalton asked. "Better than correctly. You're getting a formal safety citation." Russ squinted. Also, HR called about a review, not the disciplinary kind, the good kind. Dalton nodded and went to his cart. He told himself not to read too much into it. He had learned, from losing Petra, from all the years of almost thens and almost buts, not to build too high on uncertain ground. SFX, weeks passing, a calendar page turning, seasons shifting slightly. But in the weeks that followed, things began to move. Quietly, at first, he was called to HR for a formal meeting. His facilities management company had received a request, unusual but not unprecedented, from Viridian's operations division for Dalton to be assigned as a dedicated overnight security supervisor for Viridian's executive floors, with an adjusted contract that included a significant pay increase, full benefits, which his current contract only partially covered, and a direct hire pathway if he wanted to transition off the contracting model entirely in 12 months. The HR representative, a careful woman named Portia, went over it twice because she could see Dalton's expression and wanted to make sure he was following. He was following. He just couldn't quite believe it. "This is all coming from Viridian's end?" he asked. "Mr. Hale's office made the request directly to our VP of Client Relations," she said. "Which, I'll be honest with you, Dalton, never happens. We usually never even know who specifically a client wants unless there's an issue." He signed the adjusted contract 2 days later. The pay increase alone meant he could fully pay Rosie's school trip. Pay off the last of Petra's medical debt that had been sitting on a payment plan for 4 years. Buy Rosie the winter coat she needed instead of patching last year's one. Small things, huge things, everything things. Life settled into a new rhythm. Dalton's new role gave him more autonomy, more access, and more responsibility. He was good at it, the way a person is good at something when they've been doing adjacent work for 15 years and finally been given the right tools and room. He crossed paths with Conrad occasionally, always briefly, always in passing, always with a mutual nod that carried more than professional acknowledgement. The night at the lodge had created something between them that neither man would have ever named as friendship outright, but which operated like one in all the ways that mattered. Rosie asked about the man with the lodge twice. Dalton told her his name was Mr. Hale and that he ran a big company. "Or is he still sad about his son?" she asked. Dalton paused his stirring of the pasta sauce. "What makes you say that?" "He had the same eyes Mrs. Portman has when she talks about her dog that died," Rosie said. "Like something is missing, and he knows where the missing thing is, but he can't get to it." Dalton stared at his daughter. 7 years old. "I think," he said carefully, "he's working on it." SFX. A late night. Office corridor. Footsteps. He was right. 3 months after the lodge weekend, Dalton came off the elevator on the 42nd floor at 2 a.m. and found Conrad's office light on, which was not unusual. What was unusual was the sound he heard through the slightly ajar office door. Conrad's voice. Low, careful, listening more than speaking. And a younger voice, hesitant, teenage, trying to sound older than it was. But there, where Dalton went about his work quietly, looping the far end of the corridor and coming back. By the time he passed the office again, the call had ended, and Conrad was sitting in his chair, facing the window and the city lights below. Dalton paused in the doorway, not intruding, just present. Conrad heard him, turned. His face was not the lost Dalton had seen in the lodge corridor. Something else, something fragile and new, like a thing that had just decided to try existing again. He called me, Conrad said simply. Dalton leaned on the doorframe. Your son? Fletcher. He called me. First time in 4 months that he called me instead of the other way around. He exhaled. We talked for 40 minutes, about nothing important. Stupid things. A video game he's been playing. A teacher he thinks is unfair. Or the Portland weather. His voice was quiet. 40 minutes. That's everything, Dalton said. Conrad looked at him. Yeah, he said. It is. Rosie turned 8 in February. Dalton bought her a telescope, a real one, not a toy, a proper entry-level refractor that he'd saved for and researched for 3 months. He set it up in the backyard on a clear February night, and they spent 2 hours finding Jupiter's moons. She cried a little, which she would have denied immediately. So did he, which he also would have denied. Life, for the first time in a long time, felt like it was gaining something rather than losing it. And then came March. A Monday morning. Dalton had just gotten home from his shift and was sitting at the kitchen table, post-dawn, pre-Rosie waking up, when his phone rang. Portia from HR. Dalton, I need you to come in this week for a meeting. Not about your contract. Something else. He came in Thursday afternoon. The meeting was in a conference room on the 18th floor. Portia was there. So was Viridian's head of facilities operations, a buttoned-up man named Garrett Felk, who Dalton knew by name, but had never formally sat with. And, sitting at the head of the table, Conrad Hale. Conrad had a folder in front of him. He opened it before anyone else spoke. I want to offer you a position, he said. A real one, salaried, executive-level facilities and security director for this campus, with an office, a team, and a portfolio that matches what I've watched you do instinctively for the past year. Dalton looked at the folder. At Portia, at Felk, back at Conrad. I don't have a degree, Dalton said. I know. I have an MBA from Wharton, and it doesn't make me better at reading a room than you do without one. Conrad's voice was even. What you have is judgment, integrity, the ability to handle a crisis without needing to be told what to do. I've been watching how you operate for almost 6 months, and I've seen more natural leadership capacity in your nightly rounds than in half my executive team's morning meetings. Dalton was very still. The salary. Conrad nodded at Portia. She slid a page across the table. Dalton looked at the number. He kept his face neutral. But inside, something enormous and long-held, quiet, do not name it, you'll jinx it, shifted. I'd need to give my contracting company proper notice, he said, and I'd need to talk to my daughter. Conrad looked faintly amused. Just your daughter needs to approve your career decisions? She's a stakeholder, Dalton said. The amused look deepened. Fair enough. That night, Dalton made Rosie's favorite dinner, his pasta with the garlic butter sauce she called the yellow one, and let her finish her math worksheet before he sat down across from her with 2 glasses of apple juice. She looked at the apple juice, then at him. Is this a serious talk? Why do you ask? You only pour apple juice in the nice glasses when it's serious. The nice glasses are for serious things and Christmas. He stared at his 7, now 8-year-old daughter. Yeah, he said, it's a little serious. He explained it as plainly as he could, that the company where he worked had offered him a different kind of job. A bigger job, one that paid more and had different hours, daytime hours, which meant he'd be home at night instead of gone. Rosie processed this. You'd be here at night? She said. Yes. Every night? Most nights, like a regular schedule. She looked at her apple juice, then at Coop, who was sitting on the windowsill for reasons only Rosie fully understood. Would you still be able to walk me to school? That would depend on the timing, but mostly, yes. She was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed on the street outside. Dad, she said finally. Yeah? Mama would have wanted you to do the bigger job. He went very still. I know, she said in her small, certain voice, because you light up different when you're doing things that use your big brain. And she would have wanted you to use your big brain. Dalton Price looked at his daughter across a kitchen table in a small house in a suburb outside Arlington, Virginia. He thought about the lumber yard and the folded college applications and the medical bills and the double shifts and the 3 a.m. nightmares and the telescope and the yellow pasta and 2 glasses of apple juice in the nice glasses. He thought about Petra. And he thought, how did I end up with this person for a daughter? Okay, he said. His voice was not quite steady. Okay. Dalton gave his contracting company 6 weeks' notice instead of the required 4, because he believed in doing things right all the way to the end. He started his new role at Viridian in late April. The transition was not seamless. Change never is. Some of his new colleagues had worked there for years and weren't quite sure how to categorize a man who'd gone from mopping their floors to managing their security systems in under 18 months. There were a few raised eyebrows, a few too casual comments in the break room that he was mostly sure weren't meant for him to hear. He handled it the same way he handled everything, quietly, competently, without drama. Within 3 months, every single person who'd raised an eyebrow had come to him with at least one thing they needed handled that they couldn't figure out themselves. That's the thing about competence. It doesn't need to argue its case. It just shows up and does its work until the argument becomes unnecessary. Conrad's relationship with Fletcher was not a clean, cinematic reconciliation. It was messy and slow and full of awkward silences and conversations that went sideways and texts that weren't answered right away. But it was happening. Fletcher came to visit in July, 1 week in Arlington. Conrad had cleared his calendar, which, for Conrad Hale, was a gesture as dramatic as skydiving for most people. Dalton heard about it from Conrad's assistant, who mentioned it the way people mention small earthquakes, important, but still finding the right language for it. He happened to be in the lobby on a Friday afternoon when Conrad came back from taking Fletcher to the airport. They crossed paths at the elevator bank. Conrad looked different, not happy in the way that word usually implies. More like arrived. Like a man who had been in motion towards something for a long time and had finally found solid ground under his feet. "Good week?" Dalton asked. Conrad looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "Really good week." The elevator came. He stepped in. And then, just as the doors were closing, he looked at Dalton one more time. "He asked about you," Conrad said. "Fletcher. I told him what happened. The lodge, Rosie, all of it. He said—" The doors were almost closed. "He said you sounded like the kind of father he wished he'd had more of." Dalton stood there for a moment. Then he pressed the up button and waited for the next elevator, because he had work to do. But he was smiling. A lot can change in a year when you stop waiting for permission. But Dalton had built his team from the ground up, hired people based on reliability and character rather than the neatest resume, because he understood firsthand what a resume did and didn't capture. He'd implemented a new security protocol system that his predecessor had been postponing for 3 years because it seemed complicated. Dalton had it running in 11 weeks. He'd also, and this was the part that surprised even him, been approached by the facilities management company where he used to work. They'd heard through industry channels about his move and his results at Viridian, and they wanted him to consult on improving their own supervisor training program. He did it on a contract basis. On evenings when Rosie was at her after-school program, he charged appropriately for it. Because he'd learned, slowly, late, but he'd learned that competence should be priced like competence. Greta Solis, when she heard about all of it, cried in Dalton's kitchen for a full 4 minutes, and then made him a casserole. Rosie, for her part, remained entirely uncorrupted by any of it. She still named every animal she encountered. She still had opinions about Tyler Meston's lunch tray proximity. She still slept with Coop. She still demanded the yellow pasta on special occasions. But there were new things, too. She'd joined her school's science club. She'd started writing her own stories in a purple notebook, little adventures featuring a girl who was very good at noticing things most people missed. She read the ending of every book first, then the beginning, because I like to know everyone's okay before I fall in love with them. Dalton had read that last part about reading endings first and thought, "She is so much smarter than I will ever be." On a Thursday evening in October, a year and a half after the night at the lodge, Dalton was sitting at his kitchen table doing budgeting. Actual budgeting. Not the mental arithmetic of what can I cut, but the kind where you're mapping out where things are going and making decisions about the future. Rosie was doing homework across from him. She looked up. "Dad, what was your favorite subject in school?" He thought about it. Physics and math. She considered this. "You should have been a scientist." "I think about that sometimes," he said honestly. She tilted her head. "Do you wish things were different?" He looked at her across the table. Jar set the purple notebook beside her homework. At Coop on the windowsill. At the nice glasses on the shelf that they'd started using more often because, he'd decided, life was too short to save the nice things for serious occasions and Christmas. "No," he said, and meant it all the way down. Conrad called him in November. "I'm doing the retreat again. Same lodge. Aldervest signed the merger in September. We're doing a post-integration review session. Different team this time. More internal." Dalton waited. "Birch has the place ready. I wanted to ask, no obligation, if you and Rosie wanted to come out. Not to work, just come out." A pause. "Bring the telescope if she wants," Conrad added. "Stargazing is supposed to be good up there this time of year." Dalton looked out his kitchen window at the rose bush, which had done its stubborn annual blooming in July and was now dormant but undeniably still there. "Let me ask Rosie," he said. He pulled the phone from his ear. "Rosie, from upstairs." "What?" "Conrad Hale's lodge this weekend, yes or no?" A pause. Then thunderous footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, eyes enormous. "Is Sargent still there?" Dalton put the phone back to his ear. "Is Sargent still at the lodge?" Conrad. "I have no idea what that means." Dalton. "The barn cat." Conrad, a beat. "I'll ask Birch." A moment. Then, "Birch says yes. Sargent is still there, and apparently now has kittens." Dalton looked at Rosie. Her face was doing several things at once. "We're in," he said into the phone. That weekend at the lodge, but something small and important happened that Dalton knew he would carry for a very long time. It was Saturday evening. Dinner done, fire going. The executive team had retired early. Birch had gone home. The lodge was quiet in the way only places with real land around them can be quiet. Rosie had set up the telescope in the field. She was showing Conrad how to find Jupiter. Not asking. Showing. With complete authority and seriousness. Conrad was crouched down to her height, looking through the eyepiece as she directed. "Move it just left a tiny bit, left, stop there, do you see it?" And when he found the planet and the faint smudge of its moons, he made a sound of genuine surprise. "There it is," Rosie said. "Those are the Galilean moons. Galileo found them with a worse telescope than this one, and so we're basically doing better than Galileo." "That is an excellent point," Conrad said, still looking. Dalton sat in a camp chair a few feet away, blanket across his knees, coffee in hand, watching the two of them under a sky full of stars. He thought about that Tuesday night at 1:47 a.m., about a sparking wire, about saying yes to a favor, about a purple backpack with a single rain boot in it, about 40 minutes on a phone with a teenage boy who'd finally called, about the way a person's life is sometimes built not from the grand plans they make, but from the small moments they have the courage to show up for. He looked up at the sky, at Orion the hunter who never catches anything, and thought, Petra would have loved this story. He thought she probably knew how it was going. Like he was almost certain she did. Here's what I want to leave you with. Dalton Price didn't do anything extraordinary the night he found that sparking wire. He did exactly what he was trained to do. What he always did. He showed up, paid attention, and acted with judgment. He didn't network his way into a new life. He didn't fake his credentials or charm his way into a room. He didn't wait until he had the right title or the right salary or the right circumstances to be who he already was. He was already who he was. He just needed one night and one person paying attention for it to count in a bigger room. And Conrad Hale, for all his billions and his buildings and his deal sheets, needed one night in a lodge corridor to remember what he'd been running from, what was still waiting for him, what hadn't closed its door. A 17-year-old with his father's sharp mind and his mother's stubbornness and 40 minutes worth of things to say. These stories happen every day, in every building, in every city in this country. The man no one notices. The choice that looks small. The favor that changes everything. The question isn't whether moments like these will come for you. The question is whether you'll show up to them as fully yourself as Dalton Price showed up to that sparking wire at 1:47 a.m. with nothing but a flashlight, a tool bag, and a work ethic his parents gave him when he was too young to know how valuable it was. Be that person. Whatever room you're in, whatever floor you're working, whatever hand you've been dealt, be the person who shows up fully. Because you never know whose 42nd floor you're standing on. And you never know who's watching, not to judge you, but to finally see you. That's the story of Dalton Price and the one night that changed everything. If this story moved you, if it hit somewhere real, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, hit that like button. It helps this channel more than you know, and it tells me you want more stories like this one. Second, subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a Crest story, because we drop new ones every day, and you do not want to miss what's coming. And third, drop something in the comments. Tell me which part hit you hardest. Tell me if you've known a Dalton in your life. Tell me if you're someone's Rosie. I read every single comment, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for staying till the end. That's what makes this channel what it is. You, still here, still listening. Until next time. This is Crest Stories, and every story matters.